Two rockets are being built right now that will decide which flag is planted on the moon first in this century, and almost nobody is watching closely enough to understand what is actually happening. One of them stands taller than a 40-story building and is designed to be caught out of the sky by two mechanical arms. The other is being built in near total secrecy by a nation that has never lost the political will to finish what it starts. By the year 2030, one of these machines, or possibly both, will attempt to put human beings back on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. This is not science fiction, and it is not a distant fantasy. Engineers are welding the steel right now. Test stands are firing right now. And the decisions being made in Texas and in Hainan this year will determine whether the next person to walk on the moon speaks English or Mandarin. Stay with me for the next hour because I am going to walk you through every rocket, every lander, every timeline delay, and every strategic advantage on both sides, using the most current information available, so that by the end you will understand this new space race better than most journalists covering it. Let us start with why this even matters. For 50 years, going back to the surface of the moon was treated as a solved problem that nobody needed to repeat. Apollo proved humans could get there, planted some flags, collected some rocks, and then the political will evaporated. The Cold War ended, budgets shifted, and the moon became a place we visited once and then left alone. That changed over the last decade for one simple reason. The moon is no longer just a symbolic destination. It is now understood to be a resource-rich, strategically vital piece of real estate, and whoever controls the most valuable regions of it, particularly the permanently shadowed craters at the lunar South Pole where water ice has been accumulating for billions of years, will control the future economy of cislunar space. Water ice can be split into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen and oxygen can become rocket fuel. Rocket fuel produced on the moon, rather than launched from Earth's deep gravity well, changes the entire economics of deep space exploration. This is why both the United States and China have built entire national programs around reaching the same handful of craters near the lunar South Pole, and why the rockets meant to get astronauts there have become symbols of a much larger competition. Let us begin with the American side of the equation, and the vehicle that has captured more public attention than any rocket since the Saturn V Starship, built by SpaceX, is the largest and most powerful launch vehicle ever constructed. When fully stacked with its super-heavy booster, the complete system stands close to 40 stories tall. It is designed from the ground up to be fully reusable, meaning both the booster and the upper stage are meant to return to Earth, be caught by mechanical arms on the launch tower nicknamed Mechazilla, and be refurbished for another flight within days rather than months. This is a fundamentally different philosophy from every government-funded rocket that came before it. Instead of building an expensive vehicle that gets thrown away after a single use, SpaceX is trying to make orbital spaceflight function more like commercial aviation, where the same vehicle flies again and again, and the cost per launch drops dramatically with every reuse. By 2026, Starship had moved past its experimental phase and into what engineers call early operational service. The vehicle has completed a lengthy series of integrated flight tests, and both the booster and the upper stage have been successfully caught and reflown multiple times, something that has never been achieved before with an orbital-class rocket of this size. The program has already begun deploying next-generation Starlink satellites that are too large and too heavy to fit on any other rocket, which gives SpaceX a commercial revenue stream to fund the more experimental lunar and Martian side of the program. At the same time, engineers have been working through real and serious challenges. Early flights of the newer Block 2 version of the vehicle suffered losses of the upper stage either in orbit or during re-entry, and it took an intense engineering push to correct those failures before the vehicle could be trusted with the milestones that actually matter for a moon landing. Those milestones center on one extremely difficult piece of engineering that nobody has ever done at this scale before, called orbital propellant transfer. Here is the challenge in simple terms. Starship is enormous, but it cannot carry enough fuel to launch from Earth, fly to the moon, land, take off again, and return, all in a single tank of propellant. The solution SpaceX has proposed is to launch a Starship configured as a fuel depot into orbit around Earth, and then launch a series of additional Starships configured as tankers to rendezvous with that depot, and transfer methane and liquid oxygen from one vehicle to another while both are in orbit. Only after the depot is sufficiently full can the lunar lander version of Starship, called Starship ILRS, depart for the moon with a full tank. This requires more than 10 successful tanker launches for a single lunar mission, along with a flawless propellant transfer demonstration that has not yet been completed successfully at full scale. This single technical hurdle is the reason the entire Artemis timeline keeps shifting to the right. Now let us talk about NASA's Artemis program itself, because the plan has changed significantly, and understanding the current structure is essential to understanding the real race with China. Artemis is not a single mission. It is a multi-decade campaign meant to return American astronauts to the lunar surface and eventually build a permanent presence there as a stepping stone toward Mars. Artemis 1 flew without a crew in November of 2022, testing the Orion spacecraft and the Space Launch System rocket on an uncrewed trip around the moon. Artemis 2, the first crewed flight of the program, carried 4 astronauts on a lunar flyby trajectory, testing life support systems with a human crew aboard for the first time since Apollo. This mission has been compared by engineers to Apollo 8, the historic flight that first carried humans beyond low Earth orbit and around the far side of the moon, although Artemis 2's trajectory did not require a full lunar orbit. Here is where the plan changed in a way that surprised a lot of space observers. Artemis 3, which was originally supposed to be the crewed lunar landing itself, has been restructured. Rather than attempting the landing on the third mission, NASA now plans for Artemis 3 to be a systems integration test flown entirely in low Earth orbit. During this mission, an Orion spacecraft carrying 4 astronauts will rendezvous and dock. Not with the moon, but with 2 separate lunar lander prototypes, one from SpaceX and one from Blue Origin, while remaining in Earth orbit the entire time. The SpaceX vehicle involved will be a Starship variant fitted with a docking mechanism, but without a full crew cabin or life support system, meaning the astronauts will observe and test docking procedures without actually entering the lander. Blue Origin's vehicle, based on their Blue Moon lander line, will include a working life support system, allowing the crew to briefly enter and evaluate its internal systems. NASA has described this restructured mission as a risk reduction step, designed to validate the extremely complex choreography of multiple spacecraft meeting in orbit before committing a crew to an actual landing attempt. The real lunar landing, under the current plan, will happen on Artemis 4, targeted for the year 2028, although anyone who has followed this program for more than a few years knows that Artemis dates have slipped before and are likely to slip again. Artemis 4 will use whichever lander, SpaceX's Starship ILRS or Blue Origin's Blue Moon, has proven itself ready through the testing conducted on Artemis 3. Assuming Starship is selected, the mission architecture has also been revised. Rather than docking with Orion in a distant lunar orbit called a near-rectilinear halo orbit, which was the original plan, the newly announced approach has Starship docking with Orion in low Earth orbit instead. Starship will then perform the trans-lunar injection burn itself, carrying the docked Orion spacecraft all the way to low lunar orbit. NASA officials have said this change improves crew safety, because the riskiest docking maneuver now happens close to home, where a problem can be addressed quickly, rather than out near the moon where an abort would take days. It also reduces the number of separate propellant tanker launches required, because the more direct trajectory to the moon needs less total fuel than the original plan. The Space Launch System rocket, which carries Orion into space, deserves its own explanation because it represents an entirely different philosophy from Starship. Where Starship is designed to be fully reusable and rapidly refurbished, the Space Launch System is expendable, meaning each rocket is used exactly once and then discarded, in the tradition of every human-rated rocket built before SpaceX changed the conversation. The Space Launch System generates roughly 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, making it the most powerful rocket ever used to carry humans, even more powerful than the launch that sends Starship to orbit in terms of the crew-carrying configuration. Although its total payload capacity to a trans-lunar trajectory is smaller than what the fully expendable version of Starship or the historic Saturn V could deliver. NASA had originally planned to upgrade the Space Launch System to more powerful configurations called Block 1B and Block 2, but those upgrade plans were canceled in early 2026 in favor of standardizing on the current Block 1 design, a decision made explicitly to reduce program risk and protect the schedule. Now let us cross the Pacific and examine what China is building, because the picture on that side of the world is in some ways more disciplined and in other ways more opaque. The rocket most people associate with China's moon ambitions when they hear the name Long March 9 is actually not the vehicle that will carry Chinese astronauts to the lunar surface in this decade. This is a common point of confusion, so let us clear it up properly. The vehicle China is building specifically for its crewed lunar landing attempt before 2030 is called the Long March 10, a super heavy lift rocket standing over 90 meters tall with a triple-core configuration and a combined liftoff thrust exceeding 2,600 tons. The Long March 9 is a separate, even larger vehicle, intended primarily for the later phase of lunar development, specifically the construction of the International Lunar Research Station beginning in the early 2030s, when China will need to deliver much heavier cargo, habitats, and infrastructure to the lunar surface than a crewed landing mission alone requires. Focusing first on the crewed landing architecture, the Long March 10 is designed to launch two critical pieces of hardware on two completely separate flights. The first is the Mengzhu spacecraft, China's next-generation crew capsule, which will carry the astronauts themselves, and is designed with a modular architecture that can be configured either for lunar missions or for trips to China's Tiangong space station in low Earth orbit. The second is the Lanyu lunar lander, a vehicle whose name is drawn from a poem written by Mao Zedong and translates roughly to embracing the moon. Lanyu is built from two segments, a landing stage that carries the astronauts down to the surface, and a propulsion stage that provides the fuel for descent before separating during the final moments before touchdown. The complete lander has a mass of nearly 26 tons and is designed to carry two astronauts along with a small lunar rover. The mission profile China has designed is deliberately similar in structure to what NASA once proposed for its canceled Constellation program in the 2000s, and it is worth understanding why. Rather than trying to launch the crew capsule and the lunar lander together on a single enormous rocket, the way Apollo did with the Saturn V, China launches them separately. One Long March 10 carries the crewed Mengzhu spacecraft toward the moon. A second Long March 10, launched separately, carries the uncrewed Lanyu lander toward the moon. The two vehicles rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit. Two of the astronauts then transfer from Mengzhu into Lanyu for the actual descent to the surface, while Mengzhu remains in lunar orbit waiting for their return, very similar in concept to how the Apollo command module waited in orbit while the lunar module descended, though with more modern hardware and a longer planned surface stay. The testing pace behind this plan has been genuinely aggressive by international standards. In February of 2026, China conducted a flight test using a single-stage version of the Long March 10, carrying an uncrewed Mengzhu capsule from the Wenchang launch site, successfully demonstrating an in-flight abort system that would pull the crew capsule to safety in the event of a launch failure, followed by a controlled propulsive splashdown of the rocket stage itself into the South China Sea. A recovery technique that traditional expendable rockets like the Space Launch System are not designed to attempt at all. This was followed by additional milestones through the middle of 2026, including a successful debut flight of a reusable Long March 10 variant that achieved a controlled landing using a net-based recovery system on a sea platform, marking China's first successful controlled recovery of an orbital-class rocket stage. Chinese officials have stated publicly that development of the Long March 10 rocket, the Mengzhu spacecraft, and the Lanyu lander is proceeding, in their words, from planning into flight-validated hardware, and the country has set a target of landing Chinese astronauts on the moon before the year 2030, with an uncrewed joint test of the full Mengzhu and Lanyu stack expected in the 2028 to 2029 window ahead of the crewed attempt. This brings us to the Long March 9 itself, the rocket most closely associated in public imagination with China's answer to Starship, even though its actual role is different from what many assume. The Long March 9 is being developed as China's true super heavy lift vehicle, intended to eventually rival or exceed Starship's raw lift capacity to orbit. Where the Long March 10 is optimized specifically for the crewed landing architecture using two separate launches, the Long March 9 is intended for the much larger cargo demands of building a permanent lunar base. This includes delivering habitat modules, power systems, in-situ resource utilization equipment for mining and processing lunar ice, and eventually the infrastructure needed to support long-duration crewed stays rather than short flag and footprints missions. China has indicated that later iterations of the Long March 9 program are also exploring reusability, taking inspiration from the same catch and refly philosophy that SpaceX pioneered with Starship. Although the Long March 9 remains earlier in its development timeline than the Long March 10 and is not expected to be ready for its role in lunar base construction until the early 2030s, several years after the first crewed landing is expected to occur. Now let us step back and compare the philosophies behind these two national programs, because the differences here are just as important as the differences between the rockets themselves. The Artemis program is built on a fundamentally commercial and internationally distributed model. NASA does not own or build the human landing system hardware itself. Instead, the agency purchases lunar landing services from private companies, currently SpaceX and Blue Origin, who design, build, and retain ownership of their respective landers, competing with each other for NASA's business much the same way commercial airlines compete for passengers. This approach has brought remarkable innovation and dramatically lower costs per launch, but it has also introduced a level of schedule unpredictability that a government-run program does not usually face, because NASA's timeline is now dependent on the pace of private companies, solving extraordinarily difficult engineering problems like orbital refueling on their own commercial schedules, which do not always align neatly with government planning cycles. China's approach could not be more different. The entire crewed lunar program, from the Long March 10 rocket to the Mengzhu spacecraft to the Lanyu lander to the spacesuits and lunar rover, is developed under a single centralized state-owned contractor, the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, working under the direction of the China Manned Space Agency. There is no competing commercial bid process, no rival company offering an alternative lander, and no need to coordinate schedules between multiple independently operating private firms. Every major hardware element is being developed on a synchronized, government-directed timeline, and Chinese officials have been notably specific and consistent about the target date of landing before 2030, a level of public schedule confidence that stands in contrast to the more frequently shifting dates coming out of the American program. This difference matters enormously when you consider the broader race to establish a permanent presence on the moon, not just plant a flag and leave. NASA's long-term vision includes the Lunar Gateway, a small space station intended to orbit the moon and serve as a staging point for surface missions, developed with international partners including the European Space Agency, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, and others. However, NASA has recently shifted its near-term focus away from Gateway and toward developing a lunar surface base more directly, with the Gateway elements likely to be repurposed for other future projects, rather than serving as the centerpiece of early Artemis missions the way originally envisioned. On the Chinese and Russian side, the equivalent long-term vision is called the International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS, a joint project between China's National Space Administration and Russia's Roscosmos that has formally invited other nations and international organizations to participate as partners rather than leaders. The stated plan is to begin constructing this permanent research station at the lunar South Pole starting in 2031, using the heavy lift capacity of the Long March 9 to deliver the infrastructure needed for sustained human habitation, resource extraction, and long-duration scientific research, positioning it as an explicit alternative to the American-led Artemis coalition for any country that does not want to operate under United States-led space policy frameworks. Let us talk honestly about who is actually ahead right now, because reasonable experts disagree, and the honest answer depends on which milestone you consider most important. If you measure raw rocket engineering capability, SpaceX currently holds a clear lead. Starship has already flown, has already demonstrated full-stack reusability with both stages being caught and reflown, a feat no other rocket on Earth has achieved, and has already begun generating commercial revenue through satellite deployment missions that help fund the more experimental lunar work. China's Long March 10 and Long March 9, by comparison, are still working through their early flight test phases, with the Long March 9 notably further behind in its development schedule than the crew-rated Long March 10. But if you measure programmatic discipline and schedule reliability, the picture flips in China's favor. American officials and independent analysts have repeatedly pointed out that Artemis 3, once intended as the crewed landing mission, has now been pushed back and restructured multiple times, most recently reprofiled as a low Earth orbit test flight rather than an actual moon landing, with the true crewed landing attempt now pointed at Artemis 4 in 2028, a date that itself carries real risk of slipping further given the unresolved challenge of orbital propellant transfer at scale. China, meanwhile, has been executing a slower but remarkably consistent public timeline, hitting stated milestones for its rocket and spacecraft testing on schedule, and maintaining its stated target of a crewed landing before 2030 without the kind of dramatic architecture reversals that have characterized the American program. Some space policy analysts, including researchers who track this competition closely, have explicitly noted that if China maintains its centralized, synchronized development pace, it holds a real chance of landing astronauts back on the moon before American astronauts return, even though the American Artemis 2 mission has already successfully carried a crew around the moon, and America maintains a significant technological lead in reusable rocket engineering. What does this mean for the rest of us, watching from Earth with no direct stake in either national program beyond curiosity and national pride? It means the 2020s are shaping up to be remembered as the decade when the second space race truly began, not as a Cold War contest between two ideological blocs, but as a competition between a commercially driven, internationally partnered American coalition and a centralized, state-directed Chinese and Russian-led alliance, both racing toward the exact same handful of ice-rich craters at the lunar South Pole. Whoever secures reliable access to that water ice first gains an enormous head start in establishing the infrastructure for everything that follows, from lunar mining operations to fuel depots that could one day support missions deeper into the solar system, including eventually Mars itself. The rockets we have discussed today, Starship and the Space Launch System on one side, the Long March 10 and Long March 9 on the other, are not just impressive feats of engineering. They are the opening moves in a competition that will likely determine the balance of power in space for the rest of this century. Before we close, it is worth remembering just how remarkable it is that any of this is happening again at all. For most of the last 50 years, a return to the moon felt like ancient history rather than an active engineering project. Now we have two nations independently building super heavy lift rockets, crew capsules and landers, testing abort systems, practicing propulsive splashdowns, and racing toward the same lunar South Pole within the same decade. Whether the first boots to touch that ice-rich lunar soil again belong to an American astronaut riding down in a Starship lander, or a Chinese taikonaut descending in the Lanyu vehicle, the fact that this competition exists at all marks a genuine turning point in the history of human space exploration. The next few years, as propellant transfer tests, orbital demonstrations, and rocket static fires continue on both sides of the Pacific, will tell us who gets there first. Keep watching because history is being written right now, one test flight at a time.